I have an uncomfortable feeling that what Brian just told you was the good news, that government waste is impossible to get rid of. In talking about taming leviathan, I want to quote Yogi Berra, who said, "You've got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there." And I think when it comes to reducing the size of government, this has been at the heart of our problem for a great many years. Ralph Klein, for instance, in his attempt to tame leviathan, once said, "You have to go hunting where the ducks are," which was very Ralph Klein, nice, folksy, easy to understand, indicated a clear direction in which he then didn't go. Because governments spend money primarily on social programs. That is where the bulk of the money goes. Healthcare alone is over 40% of almost every provincial budget. And if you want governments to spend less, they have to do less. And by do less, although I'm quite in agreement with Brian about things like marketing freshwater fish from Manitoba, I am almost certain that we have things in this country called stores, and that stores will sell you fish. I mean, I've actually been in stores and bought fish. So I speak from experience here. I've purchased fish in stores. But even if you could wage a ruthless war on waste, and you can't, it wouldn't be enough. And I say you can't for one very good reason. People have been doing it for decades because budgets have been under enormous pressure for decades. And finance ministers do not want to disappoint voters by taking away goodies. So they try to eliminate waste. And they fail. As Milton Friedman once said, there's no such thing as government waste. He said there are simply government operations. And because governments are not subject to the pressure in the marketplace that you must produce something and sell it at a low enough cost to attract customers, but high enough cost to make a profit. And quality, obviously, is part of the picture. Governments aren't like that. Governments have never been like that, and they will never be like that. There are some things governments have to do. For instance, national defense, but they will do it wastefully. And you do your best to control it, but you have to set reasonable goals. But that's not really where the problem is. You're going to be having a tribute to Link Byfield later. I'd like to acknowledge a sentiment from Ted Byfield. And this is more than 20 years ago now. Ted Byfield wrote in BC Report, and I presume it would have run in Alberta Report as well, "The economic conservative demands that the cost of government be cut, the deficit reduced, and the debts paid. But he does not face the fact that it was the pursuit of social liberalism that caused the deficit, the debt, and the growth of government to begin with. Welfare costs spiraled upward as the family fell apart. Couples divorced and people refused to care for elderly parents or even their own children. Education budgets soared as discipline and standards disintegrated in the schools. Law enforcement became onerous when parents could no longer control their children. There can be no economic conservatism until we find ways of reestablishing social conservatism." And when I say that, or quote that, I'm not thinking primarily of social conservatism these days comes down fundamentally to abortion and gay marriage. Topics worth discussing, but on another day. The point is that ever since the end of the Second World War, governments have been trying, in the famous words of the British Beveridge Report, to provide security from cradle to grave, to look after us, to make sure that we do not want. They have been trying to provide for us materially at every stage of our lives, almost regardless of who we are. The much older function of poor relief, where governments were backstopping charity so that nobody would starve. But they were trying to do it in Victorian England at as low a level of comfort as possible, because they had learned a lesson in Elizabethan England after Henry VIII confiscated the monasteries and the church property. The church had done most social welfare, and they had fairly generous relief, and the cost became insupportable because it was often more profitable to take relief than it was to work, and so people took relief instead of working. Been there, done that. So relief is very stingy in Victorian times, but there was an enormous amount of private relief. At the turn of the 19th to 20th century, something like half the workmen in England belonged to benevolent societies. You made a small contribution every week, and in the event of illness or misfortune, the benevolent society would look after you. But the benevolent society was not bound by the law, by the rule, which the government rightly is, of treating everybody equally, so they would make sure you weren't gold bricking. They would weed out the people who were just clinging. But governments aren't doing that anymore. And it's not about the poor either. You can kind of cut social services to the poor because the poor are not very organized and they tend not to vote. So when governments have to cut, they will generally actually target the poor, and it tends to, to play well, oh, we don't want those, welfare queens and bums and so on. But if you want to know where the money's going, look at the middle class, because that is where the money is going. And it's going there because the middle class, by and large, believes that the government ought to be providing for them. If you tell people, no, you have to get your own health insurance, they will look at you as though they would rather have just seen Attila the Hun show up on horseback with a torch than you. If you tell people you're going to pay the cost of your kid's university education, all of it, they will be furious. But this is where the money goes. Actually, the C.D. Howe Institute, I noticed this in the end of last year, they put in a series of studies. And if it matters, I should declare that my brother runs the C.D. Howe Institute. But I'm not responsible for anything he says, and he's not responsible for anything I say. But they put out a series of reports on the unfunded liability for healthcare for the provinces. Start with my home province of Ontario. The headline, Ontario faces $1.19 trillion collision course with healthcare costs. That's how much money they need to have in the bank to cover the actuarially predictable payout of healthcare over the next 50 years. And don't. And Ontario has revenues of around $125 billion. So basically, they would need to put aside all their revenue for the next 10 years just to cover the cost of healthcare. Newfoundland and Labrador, City House says it's about $65 billion. Prince Edward Island, it's around $13 billion. And they've got revenues of around $1.6 billion. So again, the figure is somewhere just under 10 times annual revenue. Manitoba, $91 billion. Saskatchewan, $79 billion. Quebec, $682 billion. And of course, Alberta, $580 billion. And again, on a revenue of around $43 billion a year, it's worse in Alberta. This is where the money goes. If you had to add those unfunded liabilities to the official on-book debt, you would get a figure that would send everybody running through the streets screaming with panic. But they just bury it. And, the unfundeds are coming to dinner. I collect these things because I'm morbid and also concerned about public policy. Canada Post has something like a $6.5 billion unfunded pension shortfall. And again, C.D. Howe has been on this. C.D. Howe does actuarial work, among many other things. And at one point, they calculated all the unfunded liability in Canada. Future spending obligations in excess of future revenues as being around $2.8 trillion.
Over what period of time? Over the next 20 years?
Total. That's what you'd have to have in the bank to be actuarially sound.
Oh.
And if you look at this stuff, it's not for fish marketing, it's not for vice presidents, it's not for limousines, it's for social programs for the middle class. Because governments are inefficient. And yet, the point that Brian made, that every dollar government has, it takes from somebody. That thing about the three levels, Glenn Foster does this routine about, oh great, it's being funded by all three levels of government. Okay, so I'll take some money out of this pocket, here you go, and I'll write a check out of that pocket, and then I got some back here too. Why is the fact that I pay 3 times for a program so each level of government can pose with a giant check meant to be an improvement? Except from their point of view, because it blurs accountability. If there's a problem, they all point the finger at the other guy. But all of this, and again, another C.D. Howe number, that the bookkeeping of pension promises for public servants has actually concealing about a $58 billion hole. So again, throw another $58 billion onto the federal debt and see how great the Harper ministry is doing. It just goes on and on and on. But all of this is because of the idea that the government can make there be more than there is. That if government provides health care, we can get it more cheaply than if we had to do it ourselves. If government provides education, we can get it more cheaply than if we had to do it ourselves. And I'm not suggesting, devil take the hindmost here. What about the poor? Well, people used to provide for the poor out of their own pocket charitably. And if Canadians are the kind and compassionate people that we are repeatedly assured they are in the rhetoric of the left, which I believe is true, I believe Canadians are kind and responsible, they will look after it. Because with all this government healthcare that's free, you're paying taxes. Like I say, it's over 40% of the spending in most provinces. So over 40% of your provincial taxes, all the provincial taxes you pay, not just provincial income tax, all the taxes that go to the province are going into the healthcare system. If you had that money, could you buy yourself health insurance and provide for your neighbor who can't afford it? Would you have something left over for charity? Would insurance markets be more rational? Would the structure of costs in the healthcare system be more efficient? Of course it would. There would be more healthcare if we did it that way, but we do not do it that way. If you had to pay the full cost of education, would people hang around doing 4-year sociology degrees who do not have a calling to be sociologists? I do not mind people who really need to be sociologists, but too many people are at university because it's expected. It's meant to be the ticket. Your parents will be embarrassed if you don't get a university education. But all those calculations are a lot easier to make when you're not paying for it. And again, would universities be paying over $100,000 to tenured professors to teach 4 or 5 courses a year and then scraping by paying sessionals? No, of course not. The whole structure would be different. Universities should be privatized. Why on earth is higher education in the hands of the government? Who, in principle, would ever argue that they do it better in any conceivable dimension? And yet, I picked up the Globe and Mail. You know, the Globe and Mail is the voice of the great and the good. I love to read the Globe and Mail because it tells me what they're thinking. It really is marvelously efficient, as a matter of fact. So the whole editorial stack is taken up today with a comment about Stephen Harper saying that we need to do something about our retirement system. And Harper says that the CPP is fully funded, actuarially sound, and does not need to be changed. But other elements are in trouble. And the Globe said, yes, that's true. OAS is in huge trouble. It's got runaway costs. It is, and raising the retirement age is on the backs of the poor. You know, that usual thing. When you don't know what to say on the backs of. It's like cutting on the backs of somebody. So what are they, a cutting board? I don't even understand this metaphor. Could we at least have something that conjures up an image in my mind? But the Globe and Mail points out that the problem with OAS is that when it was brought in, there were 7 workers for every retired person. Now there are about roughly 4, and in 15 years it'll be 2 to 1. And so, what does the Globe say needs to be done? You got it. Expand the CPP. The idea that the solution does not lie with government is incomprehensible to the graybeards on their editorial board. They cannot get their minds around it. Where's the money going to come from? If you have 2 workers for every retiree, then either the money's been put aside for retirement or else it's got to come out of their pockets as they work. This math is inexorable, but they don't see it that way because somebody was talking about Bastiat and the law the other night. Well, Bastiat says that the state is not a breast that fills itself with milk. But this idea is one that people have a lot of trouble with, and that's why they think if you expand the CPP, and of course in Ontario, Kathleen Wynne wants to do this, you take money from the money tree and you put it in a retirement fund, and when people retire, they get retirement benefits. No, you take the money from people. And that means they have less money to put into their own retirement because more of their money has gone into a government fund. Unless the government is more efficient than the private sector, this will leave less total money when they retire. And yet, we cannot get our minds around the notion, I don't mean we in this room, I mean we more generally, that the government can make there be more than there is. And again, there was recently a news story about Germany. You know, Germany's having this big dust-up with Greece over whether Greece can walk away from its debts or whether it should keep borrowing money in the desperate hope that one day it'll all work out. You know, both positions, it seems to me, are profoundly irresponsible. But Germany has actually got its back to the wall. And some senior official from Chancellor Angela Merkel's office said we've got 45 million working-age people, but 6.7 million are going to retire over the next 10 years. And minus a very much smaller number who will join the workforce, and this is going to be a huge problem because Germany has very generous social programs. You might think they don't the way they talk, but they do. And so they do not know where they're going to get the money. So they think maybe we better get immigrants. It doesn't matter what the populace thinks, it doesn't matter what anybody says. Either we get a whole bunch of immigrants or else the system goes bust. Okay, that's not a success. That's a failure. A system that racks up trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities and then needs to get a whole new populace because the existing populace can't afford the system has failed massively. But the only way to make this stop is to cut the social programs that are causing the problem. The welfare state was a mistake. Quite simply, the welfare state was a mistake. Security from cradle to grave was a mistake. Now, the Keynesians thought at the time, when it was all brought in the late 40s, and they were excited, you know, and they were young, and the world was full of giants, that government spending money they didn't have would stimulate the economy, and then they would have the money, and it would all fund itself. But Keynesian economics was wrong, and what ended up happening is exactly the old warning. If you pay people to do things you don't want them to do, like not have a job or not save for retirement, they will do it. It's the old, if you build it, they will come. And that's what we have done. And in order to make government smaller, we have to make government smaller. It has to do less. Brian told my story about meeting with George Bush. Well, I was going around asking that question in Canada as well. I once got to put it to a panel that had Preston Manning and Jean Charest, who was then head of the Progressive Conservatives, and Nelson Rees, who was there for the NDP. And I said, I want you to tell me what government in this country is doing that it shouldn't do. I don't want it to move to a different level. I don't want more efficiency. What should it not do? Neither Manning nor Charest had an answer. Nelson Rees said, stop handing out money to corporations. And I thought the only guy who had an answer was the socialist. That was a good answer, and I think that we should definitely do this. I got all these press releases about the government handing out money to everybody with a hat, and I think it's preposterous. I get them. I do it dozens a week with the Harper Ministry boasting we have given money to this festival and we've given money to that company to start a joist factory. So what the heck is the administration doing handing out your money to a joist factory? Joists are a matter between the builder, the homeowner, the factory owner, and the person making the joists. But none of that really matters. Yeah. What really matters is that the place, if you're going to go hunting where the ducks are, you have to go and look at the social programs. And I remember at one point, I thought it was Marvin Olasky who'd said this, but it turned out it was Richard Epstein. He was talking about it, and he said, people are going to complain about this and say, but we couldn't possibly support the number of people who now need, there's 1 in 7 Americans is on food stamps or something like that. In the richest country the world has ever seen, the most productive economy in history, it's because the government is actively pushing people to take food stamps. The Obama administration is trying to remove the stigma because 1 in 7 people on food stamps isn't enough. What would be? I have no idea. But the idea that the government feeding people is efficient. Well, what Epstein said, if it is said that no system of private charitable support could handle the current level of demands, the proper answer is that no system of private support would ever have spawned the current level of demands. If the CPP and OAS didn't exist, people would have arranged their affairs differently, and they would have put aside more money for retirement. Now, it is important to understand that they cannot now do that. People have lived their lives under the current rules, and when you change policy, it is very important not to betray people's expectations. My view of dairy quotas is when you get rid of them, buy them out at current market value. Everybody who has a dairy quota believed in the system, they trusted the law not to change suddenly, you don't pull the rug out from under them. But when I worked for the Reform Party, briefly and unhappily back in the mid-90s, I produced a plan for them to wrap up the welfare state, and I said, here's what we do. Every program that goes to able-bodied people of working age, we cut down in 10 equal slices over 10 years. Every program that goes to retirees, we do it over 20 years and it's grandfathered. So everybody who's collecting CPP now gets what they're now getting and never goes down. People who start getting CPP next year get 5% less, but it never goes down. And then the year after that, of course, 10% less, but it never goes down. So you can see 20 years to see it coming, and you do something about the long-term actuarial burden. But if we don't do that, even if you could get rid of all these vice presidents and subsidies to cultural festivals, as though Canadians couldn't have culture if they didn't get a check from the government. And of course, because I've been in the process of raising money for the documentary, which, we sweated blood for a month and a half to make our $75,000, for which we're very grateful. And yet I see, a $200,000 non-repayable contribution, a $500,000 repayable. The administration is flinging around sums that make me weep on a daily basis. But even if you get rid of all of that, that's not what the problem is. The problem is the money that goes to the social programs, including to the people who administer the programs, because programs need to be administered. As Sir Humphrey Appleby says in Yes, Minister, the cause of bureaucracy is programs, and it is. Without bureaucrats, there's no accountability. But 40% of every provincial budget's going on healthcare. They get huge transfers. And of course, the Harper administration's boast is not that they have reduced those transfers, but they have raised them to record levels. Everybody is in on this. And yet there are these huge unfunded liabilities because it is not more efficient. Politically it is. They've bought votes at the expense of people who will, by the time this thing comes crashing down, of course, neither the politicians nor the voters will be around. We can put this off for another 5 years. Again, Sir Humphrey Appleby's statesmanship is about surviving into the next century. Politics is about surviving until Friday afternoon. But the core of the matter is that the welfare state consumes resources rather than generating them. And it doesn't even help the less fortunate, because as it grinds to a halt, they're going to be the most badly affected. It's like, these horror stories about waiting lists in hospitals. Who do you think's waiting in hospitals? Cabinet ministers? Tycoons? No way. I mean, the very rich, of course, can go to the United States, or they can make other arrangements. Favored people can jump the queue. It's the poor and the nameless who suffer. And that problem is only going to get worse as things go on. If we want to make government smaller, it has to stop doing things, and the primary thing it has to stop doing is trying to provide material comfort and economic security, because it's not good at that. And the harder it tries, the more it consumes resources, and it can shift them off the books, it can push them into the future, but every year the welfare state makes us a little poorer. If it had not been brought in, if we had not been paying the taxes we have been paying and having the money go to these inefficient programs for all these years, we would be a wealthier society. And again, people, oh, well, that's fine for the rich. But the thing is, the rich have money, right? The rich are always going to be okay. If you take a rich man, you take away half of what he's got, he's probably still quite a rich man. He might still be an amazingly rich man. But you take half of what a poor man has, and he's in a heap of trouble. So as the burden of government grows, and as it suffocates economic dynamism, and the jobless rate goes up, and opportunities diminish, and public services get worse, the poor suffer first and worst. So there's nothing uncompassionate about my message. My message is that it is crazy to let a system that is grinding down continue instead of doing something about it. And when we talk about doing something about it, we need an answer to the question George Bush could not answer. What he actually said was, over the din of a bad high school band in some auditorium, I said, is there something government just shouldn't be doing at all? And he went, that's a really interesting question. I'll have to get back to you. And he never did get back to me, by which I don't mean George Bush didn't take time out as president to phone me. What I mean is he never vetoed a spending bill. On his watch, government got enormously bigger, including a huge expansion of Medicare that he personally was hugely in favor of. George Bush thought the government should be supplying drugs to people. Not obviously the nasty, illegal drugs, but the good drugs. It didn't cross his mind that the government shouldn't be a pharmacist. And that's what's wrong, and that's where we have to get the argument and the public discussion and public understanding back to. You cannot make government smaller where government is big unless you make government smaller where it is big. You have to go hunting where the ducks are, and the ducks are in the social programs. And Ralph Klein didn't dare do it, and nobody else has. At best, they'll eat the seed coin. They'll fail to fund hospitals or something like that because it improves the balance sheet for the next couple of years. But in the long run, it gets worse because the hospitals are overcrowded. Conditioned gridlock is setting in. All kinds of problems. They don't have proper infection control. They can't afford new buildings that would help us manage superbugs. A number of things that we would do differently if we weren't locked into this model. And the longer we wait, the worse the financial crunch becomes. Because what are we going to do when people are 75 or 80 and we need to give them the health care they've been promised all their lives? The alternatives are hideously unattractive. You do not want to rip up the social contract, but if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. And you look at the Greek administration saying, well, we just won't pay our bills. But they're still in trouble. Where are they going to borrow if they don't pay on their existing loans? There's no answer there. The German solution, let's have the disaster in slow motion. All that does is buy you a little bit of time. And if you use the time wisely, that's important. But if you use it foolishly, it's worse. So I come back to the fact I'm infuriated by those press releases, all these ridiculous government agencies, but it's because the government promised us more than there is. Remember what Jim Prentice said about looking in the mirror? And he was right. It was a classic political gaffe. He spoke the truth. Foolish man that he was. It's because voters discovered that their key unlocked the public treasury. And they used it to give themselves more than there was and fill it with promissory notes for the next generation. And they did that because the welfare state programs create the illusion of plenty, but they don't create the plenty. They do not generate wealth, they consume it. And unless we're willing to see the thing go until it crashes, what we have to do is arrange a soft landing now that reins in the ambition of government to provide for us and protect us against want. Government can do many things. It can protect us against force and fraud. It can maintain infrastructure. It can impose weights and measures. There are many vital functions that only government can perform, but it cannot protect us against want, and it doesn't need to because we will protect one another. And when it gets in the way, it doesn't just fail to do it, it obstructs our efforts. Government has crushed private charity. Government has crushed private health insurance. Government has crushed private retirement. Government has induced people to lead lives where they spent on things they could not reasonably afford because it was going to make up the difference only if they spent the money. And that is why governments are in a hole from which it is very difficult to see how they get out. And that is why to tame Leviathan means to stop asking government for money.